welcome all of you to the Africana Studies and Research Center, and particularly and especially on this 50th anniversary of the historic Willard Strait occupation on campus. It is just really extraordinary and mind-blowing that we are at this moment. I know that there's at least one building occupant in the building, Frank Dawson, who was he's the co-producer of the landmark film, Agents of Change, all about the occupation. So I encourage those of you who haven't seen it to check it out. You can consult Mr. Dawson and he can tell you how you can purchase copies and access copies or buy screenings. So Willard Strait is just such a landmark and a pivotal moment in Cornell's history. And so today here at the Africana Studies and Research Center, we're excited to have some space for reflection. We just had a wonderful forum on Black Studies, moderated by my colleague, Ivory Brooks, and Spelman Sister, Ivory Brooks, and with the participants being the historian Russell Rickford and Stefan Bradley. So already, I've just been energized and challenged and inspired by that conversation. We're really delighted to have Professor Bradley on campus fellowshipping with us as we commemorate Willard Strait. Last night was really wonderful, with the remarkable panel featuring Harry Edwards and dialogue with Frank Dawson. And remember, please keep in mind all of the events that are happening throughout the day, so that I have heard that the march itself has been canceled in light of the weather, but the actual program related to Willard Strait, including some of the alumni, will begin at the Willard Strait Hall at 6 p.m. So if you can make it, please consider coming out. And so I just wanted to welcome all of you, and I'll turn the floor over to Professor Rickford.
My dear brother and friend, Stefan Bradley, is the Associate Professor and Chair of African American Studies at Loyola Marymount in Los Angeles, California. And I want to just mention some of his many publications and honors. He is the author of a groundbreaking text, Harlem versus Columbia University, Black Student Power in the late 1960s. He also is the editor of Alpha Phi Alpha, a legacy of greatness, the demands of transcendence, and most recently, he's the author of another amazing pioneering text, Upending the Ivory Tower, Civil Rights, Black Power, and the Ivy League. And I want to tell you that Upending the Ivory Tower will be available for purchase directly following this program. We accept cash, charge, Venmo, Bitcoin, whatever you got, Professor Bradley's primary research area, of course, has been African American history and higher ed history. He's interested in the role that youth have played in shaping post-World War II American society. He's one of the premier scholars in terms of us really grasping the significance of the changes generated by African American students. Upending the Ivory Tower, Civil Rights, Black Power, and the Ivy League details the progressive efforts of Black people at 8 elite universities during the post-war era to not only desegregate campuses, but also decolonize knowledge. Professor Bradley has won a number of awards, a recipient of a number of awards and honors for leadership, for humanitarian efforts, for his activism, and for his scholarship. And I won't go into those because they're too long to enumerate, but I will say that this is a dear brother, that he is a scholar and a gentleman. There's one thing, you know, I always learned from Brother Stefan. Brother Stefan always would, when he started his talk, acknowledge the veterans of the movement in the audience. I know we have several veterans of the movement. Of course, we want to acknowledge Brother Dawson. And one of the things that Stefan always said is, thank you for your service. Right? I thought it was a very powerful example, so I'm going to borrow that from Brother Stefan. But at the same time, I want to thank Brother Stefan for his service as well. And not just for uncovering this critically important saga, this story of the way African American students have transformed not only higher education, but the meaning of education in America, but I want to thank him for his modeling character and modeling struggle and excellence in scholarship. So it's my honor and pleasure to bring before you Brother Stefan Bradley.
Doom, 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 love supreme, love supreme. Some of you might know that, some of you don't. But that's how I feel right now. I can't tell you how I feel to be in the house that Jim Turner built.
That's right.
You may not understand what it means to me. I don't know what it means to you. But for me, I guess heaven must be like this, right? I'm looking at Harriet Tubman on the wall. I just came from the Hoyt Fuller room. That's a big deal to me. So to be in a space where Frank Dawson is sitting in the back, we talk about creation of knowledge. Somebody who would risk all of this, all of his good education. You come out here to risk all of your good education to provide us with this. This is your legacy, and I thank you for that. I thank you. I thank you. I can't tell you how happy I am to be here amongst some of the smartest people that's walking Earth right now. Let's be clear about this. Just was reading Nola Way Rooks' piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education just a few minutes ago. You do know she has multiple books that inform. Oh, yes. These are the people, see, you can't understand it because you know, I come from Yakima, Washington, a small town, and so I was never supposed to do this in the first place, but I read you, and I assign you. You see what I'm saying? Like, and now I get to talk to you and break bread with you, and you make fun of me and everything else. She said, why are you coming here looking like a deacon? I said, this is my civil rights suit. This is my Sunday go to meeting suit. Yeah. Let me tell you, and you know, I won't go on and on and on, but let's say this. Russ Rickford is one of the most intellectually honest and has some of the highest ratings of character that I've witnessed in this day and age amongst scholars. Let's be clear about this. We all fought for this whole tenure thing. People, Professor Street tenure like something like crack. Gotta give me some tenure. I need that tenure. Give me that tenure. Most of us get tenure to still be quiet. Rickford may or may not have tenure, but he's going to say what's righteous. And bless you for that, brother. So I appreciate you, and I clap for you. Here's a plan. If you don't mind, I'm going to read for a little bit. I'll freestyle for a quick second, and then maybe we can go into some questions and answers. Shouldn't take too long, but I'm so thankful that you all came out on today. Did I tell you I got to meet Harry Edwards yesterday? Did I tell you that? Somebody, look, if I fall down and bump my head on this concrete out here, put that on a t-shirt that I met Harry Edwards. It's a big deal for me. It's a big deal. So let me go ahead and read for a little bit, and then we'll go to talking. Guest commentators on MSNBC's All In with Chris Hayes usually have the luxury of a calm, well-lit studio, and scholars typically have the comfort of distance when covering significant moments. On the night of November 24, 2014, I did not. Minutes into my conversation with Chris Hayes in Ferguson, Missouri, I abruptly concluded the interview. I had been responding to his questions about the non-indictment, and I hope you heard me, non-indictment of Officer Darren Wilson for the shooting death of Ferguson teenager Michael Brown Jr. I explained that more than angry or shocked, I was sad, because the narrative of that night would be of the lawless, ungrateful black youth who delighted in destroying other people's property. I wanted to express that more than anything, what I sensed was hopelessness. But the chaotic scene unfolding off camera behind me demanded that I shift my attention elsewhere. I hastily wrapped up the MSNBC interview, crawled under the fence of a lockdown compound, and this is where skinniness means success. Serious business. There was this much room, and so I shimmied under the fence of the lockdown compound and raced to my car, which was parked 20 feet from the public storage building, which was on fire, going up in flames. I pulled on the hot door handle and entered the smoke-filled vehicle, driving through the red lights and weaving to the wrong side of the road to avoid the burning garbage cans on the right side of the street. I looked warily at the seemingly endless number of police officers and National Guardsmen. As I drove, I remembered hearing the moans, and I hope you're hearing me again, the moans of mothers, including Mike Brown's mom, and the defiant shouts of young, angry people earlier in the night after the announcement. Somehow, I was finally face to face with what I had written about for so many years. Now, do you understand how we felt? Asked a participant in the now famous 1968 Columbia University in the city of New York rebellion. He reached me by phone that night as I drove away. Listen to me, in terms of scholarship, I thought I was jamming. With my first book, I thought I was good because I had read all the documents. I was like, nobody can read more documents than me. I read all the documents and I interviewed the people too. But the one thing I couldn't do is I couldn't get the feeling of what it was to confront an institution and have to pay for it. That's what we'll talk about with Willard Straight. The night of the non-indictment, and I'll repeat it, non-indictment, when the Columbia alumnus called, I felt anxiety, fear, anger, the same kind that so many others felt a half-century ago when demonstrations and rebellions were more commonplace, when if young people like Cayman had a problem with the system or a president or a war, they took to the streets and they took over a building like Willard Straight, or just made noise to voice their displeasure. The Columbia alumnus told me to be careful, but more important, not to expend all my energy because there would be plenty more nights to demonstrate and many more issues to protest. He said I should prepare for the protracted struggle for freedom and justice. That was sage advice. Many of those black and progressive students who attended Ivy League institutions took advantage of the zeitgeist of the moment and protested what they considered injustice in the 1960s and 70s. But they also set the stage for future generations' freedom of access. Those students who activated in the decades after World War II, I say should be recognized. And that's why I'm here today. Now, let me be clear about some things. I never attended an Ivy League institution, was never good enough. It wasn't their fault, it was my fault. I wasn't good enough. If we were basing it on test scores and that kind of stuff, what is it, the SAT? Where I come from, we call it the sad ass treatment. I didn't do well on that one. They sent me a note saying that, you know, vocational schools are good schools to go to as well, and that's fine by me. And the GRE was not good enough for me. That's the way I put it. It was not good enough for me. It's not that I wasn't good enough for the GRE. It wasn't good enough for me. So I didn't write this book out of personal animus or any kind of bitterness about these 8 Ivy League institutions. I wrote this book because of what one of the scholar heroes who attended Harvard University, what he told me, what he told all of us. I'm talking about John Hope Franklin. John Hope Franklin said we have to look at confront America's past and to see it for what it is, to see it for what it was and what it is, to see it for what it was and what it is. I think you can do that through the lens of looking at Ivy League institutions. And part of the reason I feel this way is most of these institutions, with the exception of Cornell, have been around before there was a nation, for real. Before there was a constitution, before there was a Declaration of Independence, these institutions have been around. These institutions, let's be clear about this, pride themselves on creating the world's leadership class. You tell by the way they have their mottos and things like that at Princeton University. The unofficial motto is, in the nation's service and in the service of all nations. Well, doggone, I thought we were just taking philosophy class. I didn't know. In the service of all nations, huh? This is important, and it's not to be poo-pooed. The people who attended or presided over Ivy League institutions wrote the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. They chartered the United Nations. The League of Nations. They put that together. This is not small things. What? 15 U.S. presidents had degrees from Ivy League institutions. Probably most popular for me is Barack Obama, who had degrees from 2 Ivy League institutions. In his cabinet alone, 50% of the people in his cabinet had Ivy League degrees. 70% of the people of color had Ivy League degrees. Look at the Supreme Court now. What is it, 9 out of 9 have some form of an Ivy League degree? It obviously means something to somebody somewhere. I know people in the Ivy League who work in the Ivy League and students are like, it ain't nothing, it's just a degree. Come on now. Stop this. Stop the madness. It means something to somebody somewhere. And that's why I thought it would be a good prism through which to see America. These institutions, as exclusive as they are and were, thank goodness for the scandal that just came out. You all been following higher education. Thank goodness for the scandal. I'm glad that you all know it's not the black people taking up all the good affirmative action. It's the people who superimpose their face on a water polo athlete's body. Those people taking up. But I write about these institutions because these institutions create America's leadership class. And I write about students who would push against these institutions because the first black administrator at Princeton University, a man by the name of Carl Fields, he said this. He said, total democracy is to be translated from theory into practice. It will be done first in our educational students, or in our educational institutions, rather than in our political system. In our educational institutions, rather than our political system. The college or university in particular must bear the burden of this task. This is the place where you should be able, we just had a wonderful little debate on black studies in there. Some of the stuff that we talked about in that room could get you in a bar fight. That's what the university is supposed to be for. if we're waiting on Congress to create policy to get us toward freedom, then you may be waiting for a while. You may be waiting for a while. So, what I'm going to do is I'll tell you a little bit about what I did with the book. It was 4 things that I tried to do, and then I'm going to focus on Cornell for a second, because that's why I'm here. It's such a pleasure to be here. But, so there are 4 things that I tried to do with the book. Number 1 is I tried to talk about the arrival of black people to the Ivy League and when this occurred. First black student attended an Ivy League institution in 1828 out of Dartmouth College. But by and large, most of the black students who came to the Ivy League came in, most came in the post-World War II generation. But there were a few who trickled in before then. When we talk about those who trickled in before then, I write a chapter called Surviving Solitude, because that's what they had to do, survive solitude. In particular, I wrote about somebody by the name, the literary people will know this, J. Saunders Redding. J. Saunders Redding, an interesting fellow. J. Saunders Redding was in the class of 1924 at Brown University. His brother had also attended Brown University. Okay, there they go back there. Okay, a Brunonian. Yeah. And when he entered his class, there were 4 black people in the university. By the next year, 2 had graduated. He was left with another black student. He and that black student, I write about it in the book, would make sure not to be caught together in public. When they did talk, they would close the drapes in their rooms because they didn't want to give off the impression that all they cared about was black stuff. Do you see how traumatized these people were? The young man that was with J. Saunders Redding, the other black student, he told Redding, there must be someplace better than this. He said, I feel like all the white people are looking at me, waiting for me to make a bad break. He dropped out of school, leaving Redding to be the only black person in the school at the time. Not only did the young man drop out of school, but shortly afterwards he committed suicide. When I tell you there's a mechanism of survival that goes into being a black student in one of these predominantly white elite institutions, it's not hyperbole. It's not hyperbole. This is a very real thing. People talked about, that particular chapter was a hard chapter. I'm telling you about the arrival of black students. People talked about various problems. One of those problems being at Harvard University, supposed to be the most liberal of all of the institutions. Harvard gets its start in 1636, the highest in the land. That's more than 100 years before there was a Constitution and Declaration of Independence. Harvard University at least admitted black students. But an alumnus wrote to the president when confronted with the idea of a black student actually living on campus. Let me see if I can find this, because I don't want to mess it up. I don't want to mess it up. See if I can find this. When confronted with that idea, he said that one day I could imagine blacks and whites eating under the same roof, of course separately, eating under the same roof. And I'm quoting, "But to sleep with a nigger is a horse of another color." This was the most enlightened institution in the country. Do you understand what I'm saying? Now, we'd like to think that that was a one-off. But the president of the institution at the time said, well, I don't want to upset the 99.5% of students for the 0.5% of students. This is important because one of the things that we're going to talk about later on is this idea of coercion, right? That people say that in taking over Willis Strait Hall, that these students coerced the administration into making concessions. I make the argument, and I think I'm on solid ground, and we can tussle if you want. There's some grass outside. But I told you, this is 150 pounds of thunder. You don't want this. I rocks with these like Hercules. Coercion is an alumni base that says some students aren't qualified no matter how good they are academically. And you shouldn't let them live where they should live. You thought I was just talking about men. Much of my story, when we talk about the arrival of black students, much of my story is male-centric. These Ivy League institutions, with the exception of Cornell, didn't become coeducational until the early 70s. And I cut off in 75. And so the black women came to Cornell University early on. Early on. Mary Church Terrell and these kinds of people were here. Cornell, of course, had a rule. The women went to Sage College at the time, and Cornell had a rule where all women, I think they said all ladies, must stay on campus. That was until, of course, black women were to stay on campus. I guess they didn't get to be ladies because they said you cannot stay on campus. Now, small thing but a big thing. You all know Ithaca better than I do. I just been riding with the Uber driver who was late and didn't know where he was going. Going up and down these hills and everything else. So the way it worked was if you stayed off campus, and that's precisely what black students had to do, stay off campus, that means you had to come up the hill every day to get to the library. That means when it came time for your lab or whatever it was, you had to do extra work. And you were supposed to compete with those fellow students. This is much more than one bargains for. By the way, students protested. I write about black student protesters, but I need to probably write more about white student protesters who protested against black women staying on campus. They had a protest to the dean of Sage College. It got so bad that my brother here said he worked for the NAACP at one point or another. They had to call the NAACP to come to ensure that black women could stay on campus. I only mention this because housing and black women would be a problem at Cornell University for another 50 or 60 years. And it would be at the root of what happened over there at Strait Hall. Follow me if you can. Black students couldn't attend Princeton University until the 1940s. Isn't this something? Couldn't attend. You know, Woodrow Wilson had been president of Princeton University. This is the man that tried to bring democracy to the world. I guess he skipped over Princeton. It's all fascinating to me. W.E.B. Du Bois, who had been the first African American to get a PhD from Harvard, he quite clearly said that I was at Harvard, but not of Harvard. And I know you can catch what he meant. He wrote to Woodrow Wilson asking if any black students had ever attended Princeton University. Woodrow Wilson sent a note back explaining that no black students had ever been there before, and that in his mind, no black students will ever attend there because it's not the type of institution for black students. That perhaps Harvard or one of these other northern universities might be best. I guess he forgot New Jersey is northern, but this was the way of the world for him. That's the D.W. Griffith Birth of a Nation, was history written in lightning president. That was him. He had been president of Princeton University. I like this idea of admissions. I'm not going to belabor the point. I like the idea of admissions because different people took different approaches to this. So some people tried to do the National Scholarship Foundation for Negro Students program, where it was something like the United Negro College Fund, but for kind of elite northern universities, where they would get black students from the South and things like this. Some people tried that approach. Others put together different things like a Better Chance program. I don't know if you've ever heard of this, a Better Chance program. That came around in the early 1960s. That was an opportunity for students. They would send them to these prep schools and things like this to try to train them to be Ivy League students and things like this. One of our good historian buddies, Kamosi Woodard, went to one of these kinds of schools to try to be refined until he realized that was the project. And he was like, I'm not your experiment. So that was one technique, fascinated by that. Dartmouth has the all-time best technique. Dartmouth College started something called the Foundation Years program, where students would come to Dartmouth College, remediate for 2 years, and then if they could pass the entrance exam, they could matriculate from there. They went to recruit in Chicago, where they recruited several members of the youth organization. Some of you might know what it's called, the Vice Lords. And so, you know, look, this is on camera. I was just playing about that. I'm not made that way. I'm not made that way. I'm soft. Recruited the founder of the Vice Lord now, I want you to try to understand this. Ithaca is out here. It is out here. Listen to me. I took the little campus-to-campus bus. I'm like, where y'all taking me? I like it. But you remember when you was out there at Dartmouth? They had another coach out there. You fly into Boston, which is something all to itself. And then you get on another bus. That one was like 3.5 hours. And they got the music, get your motor running, and you know, but you go up there and you find yourself in the upper valley of Dartmouth, of New Hampshire. The upper valley. New Hampshire is one of the whitest states in the Union. This is not derogatory, I'm just telling you. One of the whitest states in the Union. Hanover is one of the whitest cities in the Union, and Dartmouth College is one of the whitest institutions in the Union. They brought to campus these gang members, and some of these gang members graduated. Now, I only tell the story because it happened because a white student who was active in the civil rights movement had been down in SNCC in Mississippi. Once he graduated Dartmouth College, he went to embed himself in a study in Chicago, and it happened to embed himself with the Lords. And it's not his fault, but this is how he thought about things. He was like, listen, hanging out with you guys are as smart as anybody I was going to school with up there in Dartmouth. And he came back and he told Dartmouth College this, and he said, you know, those young black youth, they're very intelligent, they just don't have resources. Anybody who's worked with black youth knows this. Like, it's not a secret. But for him, I guess it was a discovery. You know, Columbus discovered America, too. Look, I want to be invited back. I want to come back. But he made this work. He made this work. And black students from the west side of Chicago came, and many of them made good. Not all of them did. I'm not going to tell you that story. This is a different culture. Not all of them made good, but many of them did. There are possibilities. So admissions and the arrival of black people was one thing. The other thing I wanted to do with the book is talk about how black people, faculty, staff, and students created a certain kind of blackness on campus. They did it in their way, particularly after the early 1960s. And so they did so by creating organizations. Now these organizations were put together mostly for socialization and for protection in some ways. So I write about our dear fraternity, Alpha Phi Alpha, which got its start here at Cornell University in 1906. They didn't get together because they just wanted to play the guitar together and think about things. No, they got together because they knew what it felt like to be otherized in an institution. And so they wanted to be together. And so they established things like the Association of the Afro-American Society, or the Students Afro-American Society, or the Association of Black Collegians, and these kinds of groups. They were able to do that, but they did so on their terms. And I thought that that was beautiful. That was beautiful. They pushed back in a way that earlier generations did not. So you think about Du Bois's generation, you think about Charles Hamilton Houston, you think about John Hope Franklin. These people all experienced the same things, if not more than Frank Dawson's generation. But Frank Dawson's generation pushed back in a different kind of way, in part because of what was happening outside of the institution. You see, the institution couldn't exclude these social movements that were happening. And these social movements created a certain kind of atmosphere for black students to push back. I think that's fascinating to me. In fact, this is what I wanted to know. As somebody who could never get into an Ivy League institution, I wanted to know what on earth would make these black students risk their opportunity at middle-class success by protesting against their institutions. Oh, by the way, in the 1960s, there was a small thing happening in Southeast Asia that if you got kicked out of school, you became eligible for. Who would sacrifice their life in that way, and for what? Fascinating me. So that's one of the things that I want to do with the book. A third thing I wanted to do with the book is embodied with this. I wanted to talk about space, which in my mind is one of the most important things ever. Like, history is the record of people and events that takes place in time and space. And so space is not any less important than time. We remember 1968. What I remember about 1968 is the expansion of universities into black neighborhoods. You think about Columbia University expanding into West Harlem. Students took up this campaign against the institution and stood with community members. I hope you're hearing me, students. Can you hear me? They stood with community members to push back against the institution. The university, of course, wanted to build a gymnasium in the park, but only let the community use 2 floors. Come on, Brad. That's right. People said, this reminds us of something. We have to go in through the basement and can only use so many floors, but everybody else can use our floors and the entire gym, 10-floor structure. They started calling it Jim Crow. You get it? Come on. Ithaca's a tough crowd. Let's go, Cornell. Yeah. But the real issue, that was symbolic. The real issue was the fact that one Ivy League school in Manhattan owned $280 million of land, mortgages, and buildings, was the second largest landholder in the state. What on earth is an educational institution doing owning that much? Students realize this. Black students next to Harlem listen to Brother Malcolm talk about neo-colonialism. They listen to this. And so Hilton Clark, the son of Kenneth Clark, put together the Students Afro-American Society, and they pushed against that. At Penn, there used to be a neighborhood. Let me see, is anybody from Philadelphia? Anybody in here? Nobody? Oh man, usually there's somebody. There used to be a neighborhood called Mantua. You've never heard of it, and you probably never will. Today, you know what they call it? They call it University City. Mantua used to be part of the Black Bottom. It used to be the black neighborhood that surrounded the University of Pennsylvania. Let me tell you something. This space thing was important because this was the best relationship ever. This was like Beyonce and Jay-Z and I don't know who they are. Look, I gotta get hip. Anyhow, I gotta get hip. Private industry, these private institutions. Let me do this. Private nonprofit institutions that don't pay taxes worked quite nicely with federal subsidies provided through the urban renewal programs, state subsidies, and of course municipal grants that allowed for these institutions to try to clear blight. And you know what blight is? Black people's homes. To clear blight in the neighborhoods. It's amazing how Columbia University could work with David Rockefeller. You know that Rockefeller, right? That would have been, what, the grandson of John D? What, the, I guess, nephew of Rockefeller drug laws? That was the one that headed up this Morningside Heights Incorporated. Yes. Out in Penn, in West Philadelphia, students pushed against this, white students and black students alike. That's one part of the space. The other part of space that I think is important, and stop me if I'm boring you, I get caught up. The other part of space that I think is fascinating is the creation of black cultural centers and black studies centers. Can you imagine these institutions that let in 10 black students at a time? Say, I was just mentioning Dartmouth College. Dartmouth College had something called the El Hajj Malik El Shabazz Center. Everybody knows who that is. What on earth is there a Malcolm X Center doing at one of the whitest institutions in America? This was because of students, though, which was another point of my book. I don't like the narrative that kindly-hearted, liberal-minded administrators granted all of these things to people. It didn't work like that. It took students like Kamen and Zifang to go up, to push the issue. The space issue was super important. Black people wanted a space to be themselves. And so you get spaces like the Shabazz Center at Dartmouth and the Africana Studies and Research Center here. The final thing, and this is intersecting with the space issue, was the arrival of black studies. It's one of my favorite parts of writing the book. I like it because, let me just do this to you, and again, I'm ready to fight you outside. If you're feeling froggish, go ahead and leave. Like, look, you think I'm made for this. Yeah. Anyhow, I'm lean and I'm mean. Yeah. Don't believe me, I'm scared. I done talked my way out of a lot of things. Anyhow, but when we think about the arrival of black studies to these institutions that have been here before there was a United States, I don't use revolutionary frequently, but I would say that is revolutionary. I just come from Columbia yesterday. I'm looking up at Butler Library. Some of you know it, some of you don't. On the library, it's a beautiful building. Beautiful building. You see the names Herodotus, Sophocles, who else? Aristotle. Who else? I can't remember. Somebody, who was it?
Plato.
Yeah, Plato up there. Woo, all of the greatest thinkers in the world's history. Fascinating. What black students did is they said that couldn't possibly be true. There was more to the world than just that boot that existed in Europe. What they did, today we got all kinds of language for it. Today we're fresh, we're good with terms. This generation, I don't care what you say, this generation is good with terms. What they did is is they decolonize knowledge. And this to me is a big deal. It's not a small thing. Look, policies can be changed. You get the right president, you get the right provost, you get the right dean, you can change policies. Changing culture is one of the most difficult things to do on earth. And by pushing for Black studies, incorporating Black studies into the curricula of these institutions, I think that that was, well, I'll put it to you this way. They were as much Black power advocates as Huey Newton or Harry Edwards or Matt Stanford or Angela Davis. Because this is my argument, and I'm willing to roll around in the grass with you. But Black studies is one of the most enduring legacies of the Black power movement. And they brought it to the Ivy League. Fascinating to me. Fascinating to me. So what I'm going to do right now is just let's talk a little bit about Cornell and what happened here at Cornell. Some of the things that we talked about today were just beautiful. We talked about this idea of the COSEP program, which was a special educational project program which brought young people from these urban areas, Black youth from these urban areas to work here. Here's an important aspect of life that we have to remember. There is a difference between desegregation and integration. People don't understand that there's a difference. Look, so you're feeling that one. There's a difference. You can bring bodies onto campus. That's one thing to do. But for those students to have a voice, to feel a part of the institution, to help to operate the institution is an entirely different thing. So well-intentioned programs like the special education project that brought Black students onto campus, that was just half of the battle. The retention part was the other half of the battle. Black students were in charge of welcoming themselves to these institutions. And I don't think I'm on shaky ground when I say still are in charge of welcoming themselves to these institutions. And so you get a critical mass of Black students here at Cornell University, and thank goodness they were smart enough to where they had eventually one or two administrators who were in charge of working with some of these students. And these are the administrators who students remember forever. You can remember the administrator you ran to when you were in your history class and they started talking about slavery. And everybody turned to look at you. Who do you run to talk to about that? So you had a critical mass of Black students on campus. At the moment, of course, you had so many things happening outside campus. These students were coming from these neighborhoods where there had been urban rebellions, right? So you think about coming from Philadelphia, where in '68 they have the Black Power Conference, and you have uprisings in '67 in Newark and Detroit, and in '64, what was it, Harlem and Rochester, and so you had, this is where these students are coming from, so they've seen things, and they came to campus. And when they came to campus, in the book I make this argument, there was almost a pressure, and I'd be interested in hearing from Brother Dawson, but there was almost a pressure to protest on behalf of Black freedom. Part of it had to do with this. I call it double marginalization. When Black students came to a predominantly white institution based on their race alone, they were marginalized in a number of different ways, didn't get to participate in all the social activities and things like that. We understand that. But by virtue of being able to come to an Ivy League institution, that sets you apart from some of your peers back home. Some of your peers who were activating on the block. Some of your peers who were in the movement. And here you were at Cornell University. What are you doing for the people? What are you doing for the people? these students felt a certain kind of pressure. Some of them even said we felt a certain kind of guilt for having this opportunity. And so how do we assuage ourselves of this guilt? How do we relieve ourselves of this pressure? In part, it's pushing against the institution to try to get the institution to create access for people who look like me. We love to talk about the Willard Straight Hall takeover. And outside of Columbia, outside of maybe this space, nobody ever talks about it, right? The pictures that they show, that Newsweek picture, do you remember that picture? On the cover it says, militants take over campus building or something along those lines. Is that how the story goes? Militants? I don't think they would have minded being called militants. You know, it was fresh at the time to be a militant. Yeah, okay, I get it. But let's be real about this. That was an act of self-defense. We focus on, one thing we don't allow black people to be in this country is afraid. That's the one thing. Think about Trayvon Martin. This is a boy, and a grown man is following him around the neighborhood, and when he go to defend himself because he's afraid, they make him to be a thug. Watch this. When black students go to Willard Straight Hall to say we're afraid and we're going to protect ourselves, we make them into be militants. Some kind of students overstepping their boundaries that just weren't grateful enough. We gave you the special education project. Oh, this is so important. And so we focus on the Willard Straight Hall takeover, but I'm arguing that we do ourselves a disservice by only focusing on that. Now, when we do talk about the Straight Hall takeover, and I'll just talk about it for a couple seconds, because I think other people probably do it better than I do in describing the takeover. One, I think there was a militant faction of the Afro-American Society that had moved to the vanguard of the organization. I think that's important, the political element of this. And it was fostered by Black Power. I think that's an important thing. That's one. Two, why did the Willard Straight Hall takeover work? Was it the weapons that people saw? Perhaps it was. But some of it was just practical stuff. I don't know if this is in the newspaper. I tried to read the Daily Sun, but I didn't see it. James Perkins. Let me tell you something about James Perkins. Of all the Ivy League presidents in 1965 to 1970, he was the most liberal of all of them. But let me tell you something about the moment. Liberals got it, moderates got it, conservatives got it. Radical and militant youth pushed against all those groups because there were too many concessions. So even liberal James Perkins got it. Perkins, when it was found out that black students had weapons in Straight Hall, his first inclination, which is the inclination of many people who believe strongly in law and order and that sort of thing, was to call the police. The problem with calling the Ithaca police, there were 15 officers. Let me tell you something, like just so we can contextualize this. Harvard had a demonstration days before the Willard Straight Hall takeover. They called 200 police officers from all around the Boston metro area to come clear the campus, to clear the students out of the buildings and things like that. Of course, they made a mistake by imparting violence. Once you impart violence on students on a college campus, that's probably the most critical mistake you can make as an administrator, because at that point, you now radicalize people who would have not been radicalized. The other part of the story that we tell about Willard Straight Hall takeover is that everybody was down, that everybody wanted to be a part of it. That can't be possible. That can't be possible. Like we do this with the Black Power movement and the Civil Rights movement, that everybody was pumping their fists. Not everybody's made that way. Not everybody's made that way. Not everybody wanted to bring firearms inside of the building. Not everybody wanted to do that. But when you have a cross burning at the Ivory house, the cross burning is not a signal of love. The cross burning is a symbol of what's going to happen next. So here's the issue. Here's the issue. Why was there a Ivory house in the first place? This is my point about, remember when I was telling you about the Cornell women early on? Black women tried to stay in the dormitory. And they were trying to enjoy themselves and live their best lives, to use the vernacular of today. Except for the fact that some of their white peers would say, what is that stuff that stinks in your hair? And some of their white peers in the dormitory would say, can I watch you wash your hair? Now this one you all might recognize. Some were like, can I touch your hair? You said yes. No, you can't touch my hair. That's what Salon said. No, you can't. No. This is problematic. Those are what do you call it? Microaggressions. Those were the microaggressions. I haven't begun to tell you about the macroaggressions. Well, rather than deal with that, black women, along with black men, said, why don't we have our own cooperative residence situation? Things worked wonderfully. The liberal James Perkins said, fine, have your little house, do what you do, enjoy yourselves and get good grades. Go from there. That a cross burns on the lawn of black women who were staying in a cooperative. It's a symbol. So that's a threat. There were death threats called into the Ivory house and everywhere else. I told you these young people who went into Straight Hall were from these neighborhoods where they saw what police do when they come in to extract people. For them, making the decision to take over a building was tantamount to, we may just die in here tonight. And if we will die tonight, then we will do so like men and women. You know where I'm getting this from. Bob McKay, right? Yes. Now, some of this is hyper-masculine. I'm not going to pepper the story for you. Some of this is hyper-masculine. But can you understand? I can definitely feel where these students are coming from. I don't know if I've been brave enough. But I can feel where they're coming from. I think that's an important aspect of this. But that wasn't the whole story. What we need to talk about, and I think what was the most revolutionary part of this whole campaign, were the protests and demonstrations that took place for a Black Studies unit on campus that had been going on. Students who fought against the degradation that Father McFellin leveled onto people, talking about the depravity and what is it? What did he call it? I can't remember. The pathological games that ghetto children play and things like this. Students pushed against that. They said, you know what? If we had black professors to teach about urban youth, I bet you they'd figure out a different language with which to describe life. That push resulted in black students locking the president in his office, resulted in meetings. One of the reasons I like to write about this push for Black Studies in particular is because it's not sexy. We love the sexy part of this, don't we? We love the takeover, we love the guns, we love the fights. You know what's not sexy? Designing a curriculum. You know what's not sexy? A search committee to find a director, when I love how they did it here. Students who were out at Howard University, toured a black university, the protest they had there to get Black Studies at. that historically black university. There was somebody that was out there protesting that was leading the charge. Homeboy out of Chicago. They said, we want him, he'll do it. Come back to university. Perkins says, yes, you can have your Black Studies program, fine. They said, great, we have somebody to run it. His name is James Turner. You know, James Turner was hired before Straight Hall took up. You do realize, like that, he was hired, and he didn't have his contract yet, but they had extended him an offer at that point. Can you imagine? I don't know. Some of you were professors in here. I don't know. Like, am I fixing to come here after that? Like, I don't know. But people like James Turner, people like that, people like Russ and Noah Way and Carol Boyce Davy, people like that say, I want to be where the action is. And he came and he said, I'm coming under a condition. That is, I'll need the resources to create the best research center in the nation for Black Studies. But he came with a whole different approach. He said, it won't be Black Studies like the rest of these people are thinking about Black Studies, meaning just black people here in the United States. He said, I believe in what Malcolm believed in, which is Pan-Africanism. And so he coined the term, Africana Studies. To me, this is revolutionary. Look, I'm trying to tell you something about culture. Like, culture is the harder thing to do. This is the house that James Turner built. The Willard Straight Hall takeover was important because you got protections for black people living in those black residences. That was important. But one of the most enduring things they got was this. And I think it's important that we protect it. Important that we protect it. I wanted to tell you something about these students who protested all those years back. Many were traumatized. Many were traumatized. Many can't come back to the institutions where they protested. I've heard this time and again, I can't come back. This is problematic in a sense, because I was talking to one of the little sisters who is the head of the, what's it called, the BSA? Black Students United. Yeah, BSU, out here. She was saying, like, our funding is low. What on earth is happening at an Ivy League institution where a student whose funding is low? Here's the idea. If you had black students who had enjoyed themselves in the 60s, they would have been writing checks all those years. Now what you've done is you've destroyed their experience, and they are not loving of the institution. Wait for a reunion time. Go and get your 2 fingers out and start counting how many black students show up for particular classes, unless it's the black student reunion. I think this is an important thing, because this goes towards resources. And so one of the things that I'll say, and I'll get off the mic here in a second. I come from the Baptist tradition, so that's like my first. I get 2 more. It is one thing to make gains, Brother Dawson. It's one thing to win victories. You know what's harder than winning victories? Is maintaining those gains. This is what we find ourselves doing this very day with Black Studies. Constantly trying to defend. We were just talking about this. Constantly trying to defend. Turner, this man, it almost brings tears to my eyes, because I try to think about what I was doing when I just came out of graduate school. If I could think this way. Turner orchestrated a deal where the Black Studies Unit, the Africana Studies Unit here, would report directly to the provost. May not mean anything to you all who aren't in university structure and things like this, but let me tell you something. The provost is the day-to-day operation person at the university. That means whoever they wanted to, the Africana Studies and Research Center, whoever they wanted to tenure, they told the provost. The provost approved or didn't approve. This is beautiful. All around the nation, they started Black Studies programs and units and centers and things like this. The grand majority of them reported to some kind of dean, which was important. Had to send their tenure, those units that could tenure their own faculty, and most couldn't, that could tenure their faculty, had to send them to the college committee, where people who had no clue about what black people did in their studies and in their intellectual development judged them whether they were worthy or not. What James Turner did is said, we'll handle that. We're experts on black things. We'll handle that. That was a model. This is like, and I'm not saying this because I'm here, this is like the Mecca. This is like Eastern Mecca. I was out at San Francisco State College a few months ago. Look, they might have showed out on you, Rickford. Look, you got me the vegan whatever over here. Look, they had the fried chicken, you know, students asking questions, licking fingers and everything. I was like, that's where yeah, that's it. That's where I want to be. And so, that was the other Mecca. That was the other Mecca. That was the West Coast Mecca. This, in my mind, is the East Coast Mecca for what he was able to build and maintain for so many years. For so many years. Maintenance is a hard step, a very hard step. Anybody who has a relationship knows this. It was hard enough to get somebody. Keeping them is the hard part. Once they see your socks in the middle of the floor and you didn't fix the garage door like you were supposed to. Everything. I'm sorry. I was getting excited myself. Okay, I was excited myself. But this is important. I'll end like this. And this is my real ending.
One more.
Yeah, he said one more ending. One more. Students couldn't have done it without the help of their professors and the very few black administrators that were around. Here it was James Turner. Princeton, it was Carl Fields. Harvard, Martin Kilson. Problematic in a lot of ways. Archie Epps. These kinds of people. They took care of students, brought them into their houses. They couldn't have made it without these mentors. I call on my fellow professors to remember that. To remember that. Students. People constantly come up to me. They were like, you were in Ferguson. Yeah, I was day 2. You know why I was out in Ferguson? Not because I'm naturally brave, not because I feel strong and I can face down police officers on top of armored personnel vehicles with assault rifles pointed at me. That's not me. I was out there because my students were out there. Professors have to be smart enough to know when to follow. To know when to follow, to know when the young people are smart enough. Young people, oh, I love this. Young people, Canaan's age, Z-Fang's age. I'm sorry, I've been saying it wrong. My bad, Holmes. My bad. In Ferguson and in these universities after Michael Brown died, were smart enough to holler like hell when they knew people's rights were being violated. People my age tried to send emails. People their age hit the street. This is important. People ask me all the time, well, how can I be an activist? You better learn to read. This is an important thing. None of this, and I only mention this to young people because you didn't invent this whole protest movement, this movement for Black Lives. You didn't invent this. Just like you didn't invent sex. I know. This is important. Read the people who've written in this room alone. Read Shade Richardson. Talk to her about growing up in Montgomery. relationship is necessary. Students from that period, that post-World War II period, black students in the Ivy League in general, pre-World War II, maybe up until now, they were pioneers. At times they were intruders. At other times they were soldiers. But most of the time they were surviving. And I want to put it like this. We love the people that pump their fists. We love that. But resistance is in survival as well. And those who survive this elite education are victorious so long as they didn't survive it for themselves. That if they survived it to create access for somebody else. Those students who were pioneers, intruders, and soldiers, all they really wanted to be was educated and employed. That's all they really wanted to be. Oh, and these students were making the dean's list and graduating with honors, many of them. I'm thankful for them, and I'm thankful for you all for listening. Thanks so much. So we're supposed to do questions and answers. Yes.
So you just want to add a little wrinkle. You mentioned the question of space.
Yes.
Taking over communities.
Yeah.
I mean, how it is to around DC,
Yes.
but then you have another gentrification there as well, which we know. But on Dartmouth and Cornell, the space that they took over was also indigenous.
Yes. Yes.
People's space.
Yes.
So can you add that to the mix?
Yeah. Thank you.
Over.
Yeah. Thank you for mentioning that. And that's something that we never, ever talk about, which needs to be talked about. Gerald Horne is especially good at this. I don't know if you ever follow him, but in talking about, look, we should be sending letters of apology to the Native people for the cheating we've done to get their land in the name of educating America's population. So Dartmouth College was a college that was supposed to start as a college for Native people to be educated in a very paternalistic, strange kind of way. Of course, they never educated any Native people. It was for English lads who wanted education and wanted to improve their status in life. Cornell University, a similar kind of thing, that this land, this property that we occupy at this very moment, meant something to a group of people that we can't even remember the tribes. We can't even, like we say the names and things like that, that just means a street to us now. We don't think about what it means in terms of disemboweling a nation of people and taking away from their own legacy in that way. This was no less than an imperialistic effort. And I don't say these things lightly. You know, when I talked about all the philosophers on top of the buildings, there's no other way to put it, but that's what white supremacy looks like. We think white supremacy is the pointy hats and stuff like that. White supremacy looks like I will build a university and take your land and not allow you in to the university, and then put all of my heroes on the buildings and let you know that these are the most important people in the world without even referencing you. So I think that that's an important element of any story that goes on. It's not something that I particularly paid much attention to in the book, but I did reference it in some ways. So, excellent. Yes, ma'am?
I was struck by the point you made about the student. You said that I guess the BSU didn't have enough funding
Yeah.
And like that was so interesting to me because I'm thinking, yes, we should support this organization, especially if it's like classified as a club, like clubs need support from the university. But I'm also wondering too, like, can you really agitate from the inside too? Like, with the fact that like, I feel like that kind of agitation eventually gets sort of co-opted by the university. And so maybe it's good that, organizations don't have funding and are not sort of beholden to these institutions in that sense.
I get where you're going, and but yeah, it's a dangerous road.
Right.
It's a dangerous road. So I like what you're saying. I like the idea of black autonomy and that kind of stuff. I think that's a beautiful thing. How much does it cost to go here? Does anybody know? Do you not talk about that here? We don't. Okay. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to overstep.
It's a little north of 60.
Right on. Right on. You done bought all of the resources you need. Like, so yes, I say that black student organizations deserve all of that money because people are paying to attend the institution. That's their money. Like, all of that is paid through student fees and whatever endowment stuff is coming through. So yes, you deserve that. But I'm going to say this too, because I like where you're going with this. I like where you're going with this. The ability to move how you want to move will come from a relationship with not just community in Ithaca and in the city, but with alumni. And alumni will be able to say things that you can't say. Some of the things that you have to take over buildings for and that sort of thing, shed tears on camera and everything else, the things that I've seen young people have to do. You get the right alumni writing letters and showing up to the trustees meeting. It makes it a little easier on the students. But that requires a certain kind of relationship. And so I don't put this all on young people, but young people do have to reach out to alumni in that way, and alumni have to reach back out. But I don't think, just a short answer, I don't think it's a good idea to eradicate whatever kind of funding and only have external funding. I don't think that's probably the best route. Good question. Brother Tony.
Well, again, thank you for your presentation. It's sort of connected to that issue of funding and potential for an appeal that alumni. As I mentioned in some of the earlier discussions, I was here for 3 years, 68 to 71, never graduated from here. But of course, I still get the mail from the Alumni Association Class 72 asking for money.
Already.
And, part of it is that. It's not, my career was shaped partly by being here, as I mentioned earlier, as Brother Harry Edwards said, I learned probably more out of the class than I did in class. So in some respects, I do owe Cornell that. But I struggle with, so should I give my money as a retiree now? I probably could afford giving some money to Cornell. And I guess part of the reason why I'm here is to try to answer that question. It's not completely clear. So I think that you talk about the small numbers of people of color who were in the prior classes, the at best ambivalent experience that they had while they were here. I think it's a tough thing.
It's very tough, isn't it?
Yeah.
And so what I tell alumni, at the institutions that I work, write the check to the BSU. Write it directly to the BSU or to whatever organization you wanted to go to. And they'll figure out a way to use it.
Earmark it.
Yeah, because otherwise you'll get another nice building where no student of color feel welcome going into and that sort of thing. So I think it's hard. I think that's a tough lesson for us though, like getting over those feelings to try to create something for these young people today and to model it for them. Well, I won't belabor it, but if you lined up this is a question for the faculty and administrators in the room. If you lined up 10 black students, how many do you think would say that they love Cornell? Think. You lined up 10. How many would say that they love Cornell? At the institutions I work, you'd be hard pressed to find 2 of the black students that are like, I just love my institution. That's detrimental to the future. To the future. And so I think that that's part of what we have to work on. And that's why I say, like, these units, these Africana Studies units, in places like this, these black cultural centers, they mean so much to students. That's part of the co-curricular education. You know, you get your core curriculum and all that kind of stuff, but the co-curricular stuff is where you get to go lick your fingers eating, greasing your lips on chicken hips at the culture center. Look, another way is looking at me like, we don't do
I'm
that.
trying to figure out what a chicken hip is. It's literally the hip of a chicken.
Stick with me. Stick with me, bro. Stick with me. I'll teach you a whole lot. I haven't even got on the hog yet. Yes. Yes, from the blue to the two. Yes.
A couple of comments. I was affiliated with a program that is now called Feminist Gender and Sexuality Studies. It used to be called Women's Studies. I was affiliated for 9 years. So from within, it's no secret. They were looking up to Africana as a model because they wanted to have that autonomy. I heard it so many times. Instead of being a program where you cannot hire your own faculty, you cannot tenure them. Well, they can mess up some tenure processes, but they don't have that autonomy. So Africana was the model, even in terms of space. You know that space with biology that is near Devon? Yeah.
The Rockefeller Hall?
No, not Rockefeller. That the farm between Devon and... Yes, yes. I heard many times, oh, it will be so nice, centrally located, just unlike African. I heard that, and it was not confidentially said. It was an expression of their aspiration in terms of the programmatic autonomy, agency, and also space. The other comment is, so it's important that you highlight that. It's not that people hang on to that. Institutions have to evolve. However, the significance of that must be really understood properly. The other comment I want to make is the need for collaboration, strategic cooperation, collaboration. Latino Living Center, when they were protesting, looking for a space, Africana was there. That's something that I also learned from here. There were many, many struggles on this campus where you're called to contribute.
That's beautiful.
Yeah. And to the point that one day a colleague said, I don't feel like protesting. I said, you know, you're privileged to be able to say that. Do you think we are fed with protest milk when we are born? And then we crave for protest? It's our objective condition. It's what we see around us as not right.
Yes.
That when they call you, you go. But the other thing also is how our students continue to suffer. When there were so many issues, there was another cross that was burned in the White House lawn in the 1990s. This year. And you see the student coming to class. You can see that they didn't sleep. Either they were meeting for some kind of action, or simply they were stressed by all the fight. So these are just comments, but if you could say something more, how do we move forward, not to demand too much? Of course, it's
Franz Fanon, who said, you know, every generation
Yes.
has to find the tool for its own contribution. But sometimes you feel sorry not having been there. You feel sorry for our students because it's unfair. You expect them to excel just like everybody else, but they have to fight all those battles continuously.
No, that's beautiful. What you are saying is you pinpointed what life is like for Black students. That, let's be clear about this. Institutions don't change because a whole bunch of liberal administrators got together. Students oftentimes are in the vanguard of this change, and institutions change because they're agitated. Institutions otherwise are just meant to sit or to expand in various ways that maybe aren't of interest to the marginalized groups. This idea of the role that Africana Studies played in modeling for these other organizations and the collaboration that's necessary, let's be clear about this as well. One of the things that worked well for the Afro-American Society is that they had members of the Students for a Democratic Society outside of Willard Straight Hall. That was important. Now, collaboration becomes tricky. It becomes tricky because the people who are most affected have to be in the vanguard of a particular issue. So you can't have a situation where white people will be speaking for Black people and things like that. White people have to be prepared to lead, to follow Black people, follow Black leadership and things like that. But just the same when it comes to Latinx student groups and things like that, the idea is resonance of voice. The louder the voice is, the more attention people are able to grab in that way. And I think that's crucially important. And to your very last point, when writing this book, I cried at one point. I was writing about a student who was I guess this was at Princeton. He wrote of going to class, I think maybe going to an exam, and somebody leaning out of one of the dormitories and pouring urine. Can you imagine? So what do I do at this point? Like, do I go to my chemistry test and complete it? Do I go back to my room? And I'm supposed to excel, as you said. Use the word excel. I'm supposed to excel as well. So most recently, know the way Professor Rooks and myself talked about what it's like to be a Black faculty, what it's like to be a Black person in these institutions and in these spaces. That was heart-wrenching. I don't know if you read through all of those. Heart-wrenching. Heart-wrenching. And so when we talk about these things, there's a human element to it that we have to put close to our hearts. And I wrote that for those students who are intending on getting an elite education, you can do it, but you're going to leave with some scars. That's the fact. You're going to leave with some scars, and so that's why we're needed, though. Like that's why faculty members are needed to try to help with that and to warn students and to let them know when it's time to drop bombs and when it's time to cool out on this one. There'll be another thing to focus on. That's what it is. Good question. Good point. Yes?
Yeah, so you were saying you were out at San Francisco State.
Yeah.
So my understanding is, that was the first Black Studies program in the country, right?
Yeah.
My understanding is that program was almost completely defunded a couple of years ago.
Yep.
The students had to save it. Right?
Yep.
So you get a sense of how they're doing now?
Yeah, so they, on faculty, I want to say it's probably about 8, 9 faculty members, and the students, it's a fairly good number of majors and minors. But it's interesting because the same kind of protest it took to get it, it was the same kind of protest it took to save it.
The hunger strike.
Yeah. So it was a hunger strike for the whole thing, and that was no small thing. when I was reading that, I was scared, so scared for the students that, you know, because they really believed in it. But I didn't want anybody, you know, yeah, and so, but it's doing all right now. As with all Africana and Black Studies units, there's some friction inside. That's because everybody feels comfortable talking to each other in these units in a way that we wouldn't talk to anybody else. But I think they're cooking still. They're cooking still.
Thanks so much. Any Dr. Bradley?
Thank you so much. And like I said, I don't think there's any students left, but if there are students, I got discounted books for all you that got good jobs. Look, I'm taking all your money. Yeah. See you all later. Thank you so much. Thank you.